Welcome. I'm really glad that everyone's here. This class has been something I've been looking forward to starting up, and the Kola in general, we've been looking forward to starting it up. Let me just spotlight my picture there. So this is one of our first classes that we're offering in a while, actually, besides for the daily Daf Yomi and a few other things that we have on our schedule. But this is one of our first kind of new generation of classes. So I'm glad to be part of this. I'm glad everyone's here. Everyone here is able to be part of this. First of all, again, thank you all for coming. Let's get started. So to introduce myself, I am Rabbi Akiva O'Connor. I'm one of the newer members of the Portland Kollel. If you haven't met me yet, I'm around here at the Kollel. I'm here every day. I came in the summer, in July, I believe it was. So yeah, I'm happy to be here, and me and my wife, we're really excited to be here. My wife also has a class that she's been doing. She started her class last week, and it's going on for another 4 weeks. So feel free to check that out also on the Kollel website. I have always been interested in Sefer Kohelet, and I personally am interested in studying it more. And so the best way to learn something is to teach it. So this is for myself. There's a bit of a selfishness here because I'm interested in learning more about Sefer Kohelet. It's one of the most different books of Tanakh. So throughout the 24 books of Tanakh, it's divided into 3 parts. You have the Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, right, written by Moshe Rabbeinu, followed by the Nevi'im, and then following that you have the Kesuvim. So that's the writings. In the Kesuvim, there's a couple different pieces to it. Some of it was written post prophecy, so it's beyond the period of time where prophecy was relevant source of information, and some of it was still written during the times of prophecy, and that would be the case with Kohelet. So Kohelet was written by King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech. It's one of 3 books that he wrote. The other 2 being Mishlei, Proverbs, and Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs. So those are 3 books that King Solomon wrote, and they are actually all referenced in the beginning of Sefer Mishlei. In the book of Proverbs, it mentions that King Solomon wrote 3,000 parables and a number of songs and words of rebuke, and these are, and so we kind of look at the division of the 3 books written by Solomon as being these 3 things: Proverbs being his Proverbs, his actual Proverbs that he wrote; the Kohelet being his rebuke; and the Song of Songs being his songs that he wrote. So the book of Kohelet was written as a expression of King Solomon's wisdom. So we know that Solomon was the wisest of all men. All right, he was, as we say in Hebrew, Chacham Mikol Adam. He was the wisest of all men who ever lived, which, by a simple understanding of those words, that should mean that he was wiser than Moses. Now, what exactly the different definition of wisdom versus knowledge is, that would something we would have to discuss. Because, for example, King Solomon himself mentions that wisdom eluded him. The rabbis teach that that's referring to the fact that all the mitzvahs of the Torah have a reason behind them. Some of them we're privy to, and some of them we're not privy to. Moses, when he was given the Torah, was privy to all the reasons of all the mitzvahs. The outstanding one that is surprising to us is the mitzvah of Paradium, the red heifer. So the discussion of the red heifer, it talks about how the one person sprinkles the other person with ashes of the red heifer, and that turns that person the person who is sprinkled on is uncontaminated from having contracted contamination by being in contact with the dead body, whereas the person who sprinkles it is now contaminated by a twist, and he has a lower level of contamination that's easier to get rid of. So everyone's always bothered, how does the process work? And in fact, we're not privy to that information. King Solomon wanted to know that. Moses did know that. Moses was told the reasoning behind it, and Solomon again laments that he was not able to ever figure that out because that was not given to him. Now, here we have Moshe Rabbeinu having more information than King Solomon, whereas King Solomon is still the wisest of men. So again, we're going to have to differentiate a little bit between wisdom and knowledge. So whereas Moshe was privy to all the information, he was not described as the wisest of all men, whereas Solomon was. Okay, that's kind of a side point. But as it is, King Solomon, in his wisdom, brought us a number of books in Tanakh. Again, these three books: Proverbs, the Song of Songs, and Kohelet, which is often translated as Ecclesiastes. What ends up becoming very interesting is that whereas Song of Songs, for example, is a highly passionate book, it's tremendously passionate. It's full of this long allegory about a girl who's stolen from her home and from the love of her life and held prisoner by the king, and she just wants to be with her beloved. All right, and that's where we get the famous line, "Anila dodi v'dodi li," I'm to my beloved and my beloved is to me. Right, so that's Song of Songs, and Proverbs is these nuggets of wisdom, kind of one after the next, and there's a kind of a loose script to it. He's discussing in each chapter a specific idea, but it's kind of just these nuggets of wisdom. And then you have Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, which is, I would say, infamous for its darkness. It seems to be, at first light, a rather dark book, where King Solomon, we're going to see, talks about how terrible life is. At least that's what it seems to be at first glance. He talks about how we seem to struggle for nothing. He talks about how, as king of Israel, he was able to have whatever he wanted. He could have all the money. He had all the money he wanted in the world. He had all the political connections. He could get whatever he needed, but he never found pleasure, or he never found satisfaction with things that he was able to get in this world. And can seem pretty dark and can seem pretty depressing at first glance. And hopefully what we're going to be trying to do is uncovering what's really behind it. What is King Solomon trying to tell us beyond the obvious? And hopefully that will move it from something that's just depressing to something that's actually empowering. We find this already from our tradition. There's 5 books in Tanakh, 5 books specifically in writings in the Ksuvim that are referred to as Megillos. All right, so these are the 5 Megillos. Literally a Megillah would be a scroll. All right, so these are 5 books that we read in public throughout the year. Typically, we only read Torah and some of the prophets. Right, every Shabbos, every Shabbat morning, we read a passage from the Torah and we read a passage from the prophets. Rarely, and only 5 occasions throughout the year, do we read books from the writings, from the Ksuvim. Okay, those 5 times are on Passover. On Pesach, we read the Song of Songs. On Shavuos, we read Rus, the story of Ruth. On Tisha B'Av, we read the book of Eicha, of Lamentations. on Purim, obviously, we read the Megillah Esther, the story of Esther, and on Sukkot, we read we read Kohelet. And this is an interesting idea that Kohelet, which is seemingly depressing at first glance, is read on Sukkot, which is the happiest of holidays. It's the one time a year where Hashem tells us specifically, you are supposed to be happy right now. Okay. Now the Talmud has a very simple understanding of why that is. And it says basically, we're afraid that people are going to, actually it's not a Talmud, I'm sorry. It's later opinion, sources that bring down that since Sukkot is such a happy time, we're kind of afraid that people are going to go off the deep end with their happiness and kind of go overboard. That's always one of the fears we have, and it's a pretty well-found fear. So because of that, they instituted to read the book of Kohelet to kind of tamp down our unbridled excitement. It is an understanding. It is a kind of a simple understanding. It is the source of the tradition to read Kohelet on Sukkot. However, I think it's safe to say that whenever we have a tradition of the Jewish people, there's the obvious reason, and then there's also deeper levels of understanding. And so with Kohelet, I think that there's something deeper here also in the fact that we have I believe what we're trying to do is not just tamp down our unbridled happiness during the holiday of Sukkot. I think what we're trying to do is we're actually trying to understand what happiness really is. Because we're given this mitzvah, we're given this commandment in the Torah to be happy for the 7 days, for 8 days. Outside of Israel, we do 9 days of Sukkot. And so in doing that, we really need to have an understanding of what it is. What is happiness that we're trying to attain during those days of the holiday? And so that's why, I think that's one of the reasons why we focus on Kohelet during Sukkot. Do you have any questions right now? Feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions, or we can continue going. I'll give a couple seconds. Okay. And throughout the session, feel free to unmute yourself if at any point you have a question or want to understand something better. Feel free to unmute yourself and we'll address the question. Okay. My personal connection with Kohelet, I remember as a little kid, I got into studying Tanakh. And we weren't really taught much of Tanakh in school, meaning outside of the 5 books of Moses, outside of the Torah section of Tanakh, we really didn't spend much time in school. And I grew up in a Orthodox Jewish day school in Colorado, but we didn't really spend much time going through Tanakh, or through what we'd call Nach, the second half, the 2/3 after the Torah. So the words of the prophets, Nevi'im, and the Ksuvim, the writings. So one day I decided, I was probably 8, 9 years old, all right, I'm going to open up the Art Scroll Tanakh and start reading. So I opened up to Kohelet. And I start reading, and I see, okay, futility is all is futile. That's basically the opening words of the book that we're going to be seeing in just a couple minutes. And it's like, and I'm, a little kid, and I start thinking like, oh no, he's right. I start thinking like, okay, so I'm 8 years old now, or maybe I was, some 12 years old, whatever it was. I'm 12 years old, and I'm gonna keep on, getting older and older. And what purpose really is there to everything? And I remember running to my father of blessed memory and crying to him and being like, what's the purpose of all of it? Why do we do anything? And he sat me down and he was like, you only got a couple sentences in. And yes, at first glance, it seems to be that really everything is futile. And in fact, fascinatingly enough, is King Solomon goes and he repeats the line again at the very end of the book. So he bookends both of the entire book with this statement of futility is all is futile. But he also, in the process, has discussed a lot of other things and introduced us to a lot of other concepts. And maybe he's given us more of a sense of what it means for something to be futile, or for something to be happy, or for something to be worthwhile. And he said, take your time. If you want to go through it a little, take your time and get into it. I wasn't quite old enough to understand what he was saying, so I kind of put the book down and hoped to forget it. But a little while later, a couple years later, I said, you know what, I want to embrace this book, which has scared me now for all these years. So I actually started studying a little bit more, and I got a much better understanding of what's going on. So hopefully together we'll be able to get a little bit more of that understanding of what it is that King Solomon's trying to do with the book. One more thing before we actually get into the text is I'd like to show you. I'm going to share my screen here for a second. I'd like to show you a Gemara, a passage from the Talmud from Shabbos, from Shabbat. This is Shabbat 30b. So for those of you who do the Daf Yomi, you did this nearly 2 years ago, about a year and a half ago. So this is a while ago. So even if you are following the Daf Yomi, this is maybe something that it's been a while since you've seen. And the Gemara is actually discussing, the Talmud over here is discussing actually the death of King David. And it mentions that when King David was dead, he died by falling down a flight of stairs. And it was on Shabbos, it was on Shabbat, and they weren't sure whether because of the laws of Muktzah, whether they were allowed to move his body, the body of a dead person, which is why it comes up in the Talmud and Shabbat. And so in discussing that, it mentions kind of offhandedly that a living dog is greater than a dead lion, which is a verse from Kohelet. And so in the process, we mentioned Kohelet, we kind of go on a little bit of a tangent and we discuss some other things. So this Gemara over here quotes Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas, who is quoting Rav. Rav is the first generation of Amoraim, of Talmudic sages. So this is now the second generation. And he says over here that the sages sought to suppress the book of Ecclesiastes and to declare it apocryphal. Okay, they originally wanted to put away the book. Literally in Hebrew, the word here is lignoz, put into geniza. So if you've heard of the Cairo geniza, for example, right, it's where we hide books that are no longer purposeful to us. Okay, so they wanted to hide the book of Kohelet because its statements seemed to contradict each other. Why did they not do so? Because the beginning discusses Torah matters and the end discusses Torah matters. Meaning the book starts out with really something that you should know. It's important for you to know. And it ends with something that is really important for you to know. And therefore, we kept the whole book because of that reasoning. Now, I don't fully understand, and I meant to look up before the class, but I didn't get around to actually researching it. There is a science to how the rabbis codified the final copy of the final version of the Tanakh. Okay, there were certain things that they left out. So, for example, coming up to the holiday of Hanukkah, the book of Maccabees is technically part of our sources. Let's say it's part of our group of books. However, the rabbis did not officially add it to the books of Tanakh. And fascinatingly enough, is the Christians did when they codified their Testament. They added the book of Maccabees to the Old Testament, which again is not actually, we don't actually consider it as having the same status as the other books of Tanakh. So there's a science to how they did it. I have to learn more about that myself before I could give you a good understanding of what it is. So the Gemara explains what are the words of Torah that are written at the beginning of Sefer Kohelet, of the book of Kohelet. So he quotes the third passage from the book. What profit has man of all his labor which he labors under the sun? Okay, it says the sages of the school of Rabbi Yanai said, under the sun is where man has no profit from his labor. However, before the sun, meaning it's when engaged in the study of Torah, which we understand preceded the creation of the world, which preceded the sun, there is a profit. So while you may not gain much by your other endeavors in this world, King Solomon tells us, you'll never lose out by the study of Torah. Okay, so there is a words of guidance that King Solomon is giving us right off the bat. And at the end of the book, what does he tell us? He tells us the end of the matter is that all things have been heard. Fear God, keep his mitzvot, keep his commandments, for this is the whole man. This is all that is asked of man. Okay? And the Talmud asks, what does it mean, this is the whole man? Rabbi Eliezer, who was one of the sages, says, yeah, the entire world was created for fear of God, okay, for the purpose of man to fear God. Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana said it's the equivalent of the entire world. Now, exactly what the difference is between the world was created for it and it's the equivalent of the world, I'm not 100% sure myself. And Shimon ben Azai, some say it was Shimon ben Zoma, he says that the entire world was only created as a companion to this person, meaning such a person who is a God-fearing person. The world is put in place for him to manipulate in a positive sense. Okay, so we have over here the statement from the Gemara again that says that originally they wanted to put away the book of Ecclesiastes. They wanted to put away the book of Kohelet. They didn't in the end because there's important information to get from the book, and we didn't want to go editing it and throwing it all away. So we gave you the whole thing, and now it's up to us as hopefully guided individuals to find out exactly what King Solomon meant with all his seeming contradictions. So, for example, I'm not going to go through the rest of it, all of it right now, but they bring up some of these contradictions that seem to show up. For example, King Solomon writes, vexation is better than laughter, okay? Or that's a strange translation. This is using the Sefaria.org. Literally, it's over here, Tov kas misachok. Okay, that means that anger, literally, kas is anger. Anger is better than laughter. Okay, and then later in Kohelet he says, "Lischok amarti meholal." I said of laughter, it is praiseworthy. So does King Solomon like laughter, or does he not like laughter? Okay. Similarly, he has really a lot of especially when it comes to laughter and joy, is where King Solomon gets a little more. He's kind of this way and that way about it. So that's what we are going to hopefully get a chance to look into as we go through the book. Okay, I'm going to stop. Actually, no, you know what? I'm going to keep the screen share right now. I'm just going to move over to the actual text of Kohelet. Again, I'm going to just ask, does anybody have any questions before we go any further? And feel free to unmute yourself or do your little hand raise or whatever it is. Okay. All right. So we're going to get started looking at just some of the text of the book of Kohelet, of the book of Ecclesiastes, and kind of getting an idea of what's going on here. And I don't even know if we're going to get very much farther than this first introductory passage, which is, you would think there's not much to say about this verse, but actually the commentaries have quite a bit to say about this first verse over here. It's where my mouse is, and it says, Divrei Kohelet ben David Melech Yerushalayim. These are the words of Kohelet, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. Okay, and so there's a couple things that kind of stand out to us right away with this verse. First of all, we know that it was King Solomon who wrote the book. Okay, that is part of our tradition going way back. And for some reason, and by the way, in Mishlei, he almost always uses his own name. In Proverbs, except for the kind of closing chapters, he uses his own name. In the closing chapters, he uses a couple pseudonyms, but we know that they're also referring to him. In Shir HaShirim, in the Song of Songs, he starts off by saying Shir HaShirim Asher L'Shlomo. These are the Song of Songs that are to Solomon. So again, there he uses his name to tell us who he is. In Kohelet, he never uses his own name. He uses his pseudonym, Kohelet. Okay, so that's the name that he's going with. So that's, first of all, an interesting point that's just brought up right away, is why does he not sign his name onto the book? And again, throughout the book, he does this. And strangely enough, is later in the book, he's going to start referring to himself as Ha-Kohelet, the Kohelet, okay? Which is he refers to himself in a third person. I mean, well, he's always referring to himself in the third person, but he refers to himself as the so-and-so. It'd be like, the Rabbi O'Connor says. I bet that's a very strange way to refer to yourself. So even there, you start to see that it's more of a title than an actual name. But it still is fascinating that he doesn't sign his name directly onto the book and only refers to himself by his pseudonym Kohelet. Another interesting thing that you'll note right off the bat is that he was king of Jerusalem. Well, he wasn't. He was king over all of Israel, right? Depending on what time of history we're talking about, the Jewish people were divided into multiple kingdoms, okay? So, for example, before the reign of David came the reign of Saul, King Saul. So during that time, there was actually a division of kingship. Most of the Jewish people followed Saul as he was anointed by the Samuel the prophet, Shmuel Hanavi. And when David becomes king, he only originally reigns for 7 years. He only reigns over the people of Yehuda, the tribe of Judah. Okay, so and after that 7 years, for the next 33 years, he's king over the entire Jewish people. All right, the kingdom after King Solomon, his son Rechavam, was at that point the kingdom was divided between the kingdom again of Judah, which included Judah and Benjamin, and the kingdom of Israel, which was the rest of the tribes, besides for the tribe of Levi, who was kind of sprinkled throughout both kingdoms. All right. So here, interestingly enough, is King Solomon's reign was a unified reign. He was king over the entire Jewish people all at once. Never, at no point was his reign split with another person. But for some reason, again, he signs his name as king in Jerusalem, as opposed to king over the Jewish people, king over Israel. Okay. Instead, he just says king in Jerusalem. So the commentators have a lot of discussions about what exactly is going on over here. Why number one is he referring to himself by a pseudonym, and why number two is he mentioning the fact that he was king in Jerusalem and not over the rest of Israel. Okay, so those are the two kind of glaring questions that face us at the beginning of Sefer Kohelet. There's an interesting thing I found from one of the commentators is called the Mitzudas David. All right, he is one of probably the primary commentators on the books of the prophets and the writings. He doesn't, from what I know, he does not write on the Torah, on the 5 books of Moses. However, he does write a lot on the prophets and the writings, and usually he kind of sticks to explaining what the words mean, why they're there, etc. But here in his introductory passage here on Kohelet, he points out that wisdom is gained in 3 ways. Okay, the first way for a person to acquire wisdom is through tradition. Okay, they learn from somebody else. They and whatever they're taught is exactly what they know. Okay, that's usually what we refer to, like we would think of as like a knowledgeable person. All right, somebody's knowledgeable because they read a lot in books. They spent a lot of time studying from a master. Okay, so for example, my father of blessed memory was in the army in the 60s. He was stationed in Berlin during the Cold War. As we're coming up to Veterans Day, he always celebrated Veterans Day because he lived through some. He was doing some like spy work in Berlin, listening in on the Russians while they were putting up the Berlin Wall, actually. So he said that there was a guy in his unit who, he said, unfortunately was not so smart. Didn't really have much going on upstairs, but he had a photographic memory. He had all this information, but wasn't able to decipher the information. He didn't have the skills to decipher that information. So they would ask him, like, if one of their machines was broken, they'd say, "Hey, Bob, how do we fix this machine?" He's like, I don't know that stuff. And he'd sit there, be like, "Well, if you put this over here and that over there and this over here and that over there, it should work." Whatever that means to you. Yeah. So that's a case of somebody who just has information because it's given to him, but not necessarily because he has understanding. He doesn't have any understanding. So that's one path to acquiring knowledge. Another path is by taking people with different views and pitting them up against each other. So through debate, for example, through dialectics, through taking 2 opposing ideas and seeing how they respond to each other. That's the second way for a knowledge to be acquired, for it to be increased, is you take people who have the knowledge and you pit them against each other and say, all right, what do you say about this topic? What do you say about this topic? What can we come out with from this topic? And the third way to acquire knowledge is introspection, is to close in on yourself and really spend some time thinking over something and trying to understand it. It's by having the resources for yourself to go and research something, to go out there and take the time to fully understand something. So the Metzudas David points out over here that these kind of three concepts are showing up in this first verse over here. You have the fact that he is Kohelet, meaning he is King Solomon. King Solomon, who has all the resources in the world. And so he's able to spend the time. He didn't have the obligations. I mean, obviously a king has many obligations, but he didn't have a lot of the day-to-day obligations that a lot of us do have. He didn't have to worry about making a buck, So, and so he had the time to spend to really consider these matters of wisdom. Besides that, he was son of David, right? So he also had the tradition. He also had somebody to look to and guide him in his search for knowledge. He had the wisdom of generations of Torah scholars. All right, the Talmud, again, in reference to King David, says that he was busy all day. When you think of a king of Israel, you think of a guy sitting on a throne. You think of somebody taking care of matters of state. The Talmud points out that King David was busy he had his hands dirty with halacha questions, with questions of Jewish law, because a Jewish king is more than just a ruler of a state. He's also somebody who has to have a sense of knowledge, of Torah knowledge. He has to be a Torah scholar in his own right, which is why the king also, one of the concluding commandments in the Torah is that the king has to carry with him a Torah scroll wherever he goes, so that wherever he goes, he has the Torah with him and he's studying from it. And finally, King Solomon was king of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is a place where he was able to gather wise people from all over the world and bring them all to this one location and have these dialectics, have these conversations and debates, and really get into it with people and get the different ideas and different points of view on the same matter. In fact, that's also hinted by his name, Kohelet. So again, the term Kohelet actually means gathering. And as I mentioned, so the king has special mitzvot. He has special rules that apply only to the king. So one of the rules that the king must do is after the Shemitah year. So right now we are in a Shemitah year, a sabbatical year where the land of Israel lies fallow, and we don't plant it for a year. So the year following that, during the holiday of Sukkot, the king would get up and would sit in the temple, which is a rare thing, that only the king can do it, and only that one time. He sits down in the temple and he gives a long speech, and that mitzvah, that commandment, is referred to as hakel, as the gathering. Okay, so that's actually, some of the rabbis learn that the Kohelet, this entire book, the 13 chapters that we're going to go through, are speeches or bits and pieces of speeches that he gave during those gatherings. So again, here we have where King Solomon gathers all the people into Jerusalem. All Jews must come to Jerusalem. And in fact, when he was king of Israel, Jerusalem was a humongous cultural center, world-renowned cultural center. Right? We know famously, he had hundreds of wives. Most of them were political marriages for the purpose of bringing other nations to Jerusalem and showing them the beauty of our religion, the beauty of what we're offering. So you have, famously, he married the daughter of Paro, the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, and unfortunately, she's gonna lead him astray to some degree by the end of his life. But we have over there again him making these connections and bringing wise men or wise people from all over the world and trying to gather them all into one location and getting all of their ideas on one matter. To me, it's reminiscent. I recently finished my master's degree in communication. And so in communication studies, there's 3 paradigms of communication study, which is kind of typical through all throughout sociology, is that there's the interpretive paradigm of communication, where people try to understand why people communicate a certain way and understand each person's individual experience when relating to other people. And then you have they called it the post-positivist. It's the scientific way of understanding communication. When do people listen? How do we get them to listen to messages? That's a lot of your health communication, for example. Don't smoke, right? How do we get people to listen to that message? And then the third paradigm of communications research was the critical, which we all have heard a little bit about critical now because of a critical race theory, for example. So critical is where you take reality and you question everything about it. So I just found it fascinating that over here, the Metzudas David is saying a very similar idea in how to gather knowledge. There's the scientific, there's just the information that's handed down to you. There's the trying to understand people's personal experiences, the introspection, getting the dialectic, the different opinions, bouncing ideas off of each other. That's kind of your interpretive way of gaining knowledge. And finally, you have that critical understanding of, what do I think, and what are the rules that I follow in understanding this knowledge. So again, the basic idea coming down over here is that King Solomon is trying to get to the rawest form of knowledge and really trying to really understand what is life about, what are we supposed to gain from our experience here on this earth, and what does the Torah, what does Hashem want from us specifically? So again, we have times where and this is something that I personally I love about Judaism. I love Judaism. It's a great religion, particularly because it embraces every emotion. We have on Purim, for example, we're tremendously happy. We get drunk from happiness, out of happiness. Okay, and on Sukkot you have also happiness in a different form, kind of a more cultured form of happiness, so to speak. But then we've got times of the year where we're meant to be sad. For example, during the times of the destruction of the base of the temple, during Tisha B'Av and the days preceding that, times where it's expected for you to take a little time for sadness. And there's times where we're supposed to be curious. There's times where we're supposed to be confused. And everything is kind of under the umbrella of Judaism. And so Kohelet, again, is fascinating in the fact that it's a study that says not just, okay, be happy, don't be happy. It says, what is happiness, right? So we're going to see, he says, it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of drinking, to a tavern, for example. Okay. So, and he says, because when a person goes to a house of mourning, the living people who are there, the living folks who join the house of mourning, they get to really think about what they're doing. Well, that's not as sad as it looks when you first read the first half of the verse, where it says, always better to go to a house of mourning. Well, that says, you should be in mourning always, but it doesn't say that. He says, better to go to the house of mourning so that you spend some time thinking about your position in this world. Well, that's empowering. That's saying you have a purpose. That's saying there's something you're hoping to get to by the end of your 120 years. And so that's a very different message. And again, so Kohelet is really a study in not just what is expected of us, but how does the Torah, how does Hashem define all these terms that we're going to be throwing out? Okay. We have time to just read the next verse, and we'll come back to it next week. Again, and this is going to be an ongoing class. So hopefully, if you enjoy, we'd love for you to join us here week by week, which would be fantastic for us, fantastic for me personally. So please feel free to tune in. Let's just read this next verse, and then we'll close it up for this week. And this again, this famous or infamous verse over here. And I don't want to have the English up because I like how I translate it better. Havel havelim amar Koheles. Often that's translated as futility, futilities, Koheles says. Havel havelim hakol havel. Futility, futilities, all is futile. Okay. The truth of the matter is, havel does not mean futile. It actually means steam. So literally means steam of steams. STEAM. Okay. Like a wisp of steam. And so really what the literal translation would mean, steam of steams, says Koheles. Steam of steams, all is steam. Okay. Obviously the allegory is obvious, that steam is dissipating. It doesn't last. It's even lighter than smoke, for example. It's really, it just disappears. But so that's the simple understanding of what's going on over here. But hopefully next week we're going to get into a little bit. Thank you all for joining us.
Rabbi, quick question.
Yes, please.
Hevel, this is the same Hevel that we have in Eshet Chayil at the end, Hevel Hayofi?
Yes, absolutely. You got it. Hevel Hayofi there means, again, so if we want, let's say we want to use futile. So Hevel Hayofi means that beauty is futile. Again, futile is not the word I want to go for, because I think there's something more nuanced that Kohelet is trying to tell us over here. Besides for worthless, I think he's trying to say it's worth something, and hopefully we'll get into that a little bit next week. But yeah, very good. That is the exact word that we're going on. If anybody wants to stay on for another minute, if you have any questions, please feel free. Otherwise, feel free to log off.